So much blood spilled, so far away from home. But why? To understand that, we need to go back in time, all the way back to the beginning. This all started in 278 BC, a time that would later be known as the Aegean Wars. We, the Athenians, were a client state of the decrepit Macedonians ruling from Pella. This was a status below our dignity, especially as we had ambitions of a second age of Hellenic colonization. But despite the vulnerable state of the Macedonians, we didn't have the ability to declare independence just yet. We had to regain the strength we once had. We had to secure control over the Aegean. So, under supervision of the statesman Isocrates, new triaries were set to be constructed, with our archon Cremonides hiring all the available mercenaries to further establish a formidable army to enact Athenian will wherever we went. Research-wise, we set our minds towards naval innovation both militarily and commercially. We needed to pay for all this somehow, you know. Hence, we established trade with various nations across the Greek world. But that's about it. No non-aggression pacts or anything. Because trade with various nations will only be a realistic goal if we remain neutral in any major wars to come. Besides, we don't really have the resources to make an impact anyway, so why bother? Nevertheless, this was a time of expansion. Once our Athenian coffers found itself edging towards a deficit, we set sail. If we wanted hegemony over the Aegean, one of the best places to begin our expansion was at Crete, an island which military power usually consists of mercenaries, whom you know on this occasion already have been enlisted into our service. So with quite a sizable army, we initiated our assault from both land and sea, a decision that proved to be vital in our success. The Cretans definitely didn't expect our ships to roll into their port, as it was practically unguarded. But we wouldn't land right away. We waited on that till our hoplite forces reached the walls, and our cavalry made it into the streets. These factors made our assault a three-directional attack. Our hoplites were relentless and clearly superior on the walls. Our marines made a move for the town square, which was defended by the Cretan archon, leading to the defenders calling back units to help on that front. However, they would just get cut down by our cavalry. The incredible offensive was not without sacrifice, as Isocrates, the statesman in charge of the marines, fell right before the Cretans surrendered. Furthermore, we lost pretty much all of our cavalry, but so be it. The Archon survived, and the new Admiral Cleisthenes, as you also will experience soon enough, had more flair for military thinking. During these early years of the campaign, this island would consist of wheat fields and fishing docks to establish some form of trade good to bargain with. But our mind remained on a wish of constructing a mighty fleet. And for that to be a reality, it is known you have to possess the Colossus of Rhodes. So we set sail once again just to quickly return back to Crete after realizing how powerful the Rhodians actually were. But it was an advantage the island nation seemingly also knew as well, as they shortly after declared war on us. But as our coffers were less valuable than Spartan thinkers, we sought out funding from Pergamon by agreeing to a non-aggression pact, which basically felt like prostitution to us. This gold was spent on new cavalry units. But our little plan of building up a new army to overpower the Rhodians faded away as they continued to increase their numbers. We had to make a move now, so we set sail and embezzled a bit of money to spend on additional mercenaries while we raided their lands to lure them out into a battle near the coast. A scheme that succeeded as we saw the Rhodians close in on our position. We deployed our forces with their back to the coast in an effort to create an all-or-nothing mentality for our hoplites. Our elite marines landed behind our lines and would take on the role as reserve units. The engagement began on the left, where our slingers fired upon the Rhodian cavalry, which led to a massive attack with multiple units involved. The real struggle was in the middle, where our hoplites were no match for the hostile mercenary pikemen. Or that was the case until our lightly armored hoplites managed to flank around to slowly envelop the hostiles. The Athenian Archon in charge of this battle secured a heroic victory this day. With the Rhodians this vulnerable again, we immediately went on the offensive to take out the rest of their forces, granting us control over the Colossus of Rhodes and their famous port, which allowed us to construct even larger ships than the ones we already had. Furthermore, our Archon developed this skill in statecraft, which helped improve relations with other nations as well as increase tariff income. This was a trend that would spread to most of our other governors throughout the years. You'll see why soon enough. Nevertheless, the Rhodians made one final attack to push us back, but it was too late for them. Athens ruled the Aegean now, just like we always wanted. The Athenian fleet was now by far the strongest in the Greek realm, and it would quickly see action against the Illyrian pirates, whom we actually are at war with due to our client-state status to the Macedonians. However, we just expanded our fleet to then afterwards intercept the Illyrians. It was quite a messy battle. Although we did manage to ram some of the ships, some of our own actually got boarded, leaving many of our trirees getting stuck. But we had prepared for such a scenario, keeping multiple ships in reserve to intervene, meaning we quickly got the upper hand again. And this scored another heroic victory. These last two naval battles were prime examples of how clever Cleisthenes truly was in terms of naval warfare. After this battle, the rest of our enemies were so far away it allowed us to expand our ports in peace. We disbanded most of our mercenaries so we could afford to also expand the port of Rhodes. So with our newfound power, and as the opportunity to declare independence revealed itself to us, we took it without any consequences. The Macedonians simply didn't have the power to stop us, so they just set us free. And if you remember what I said earlier, we had an ambition of a second age of Hellenic colonization. Now was the time. As we didn't have to pay tribute anymore, it freed our coffers that, along with a very high taxation policy over the next couple of years, allowed us to create this incredible fleet. During this time of independence, we also made peace with the Illyrians, meaning we were in the perfect position to begin fulfilling our ambition. And so it was. In the spring of 272 BC, our two fleets, led by the naval genius Cleisthenes and the brother of the Archon Glaucus, set sail from Greece towards the western lands. But the real question was where to establish our first colony. Perhaps Sicily along with Syracuse and the other Greek colonies established there so long ago? No. Apart from Syracuse being destroyed, a major conflict between the two nations known as Carthage and Rome was roaring throughout these waters. Clearly establishing a colony anywhere near this war would result in our own warriors being drawn into conflict. Not exactly what we want. We sailed west again, further than any Greek ever did. We sailed past many lucrative locations such as Ibosim, Mastia or Tingis. The only issue was the Carthaginians held control over these locations. We simply couldn't afford to engage in a conflict with a nation of that size at this point in time. After all, it would take ages for reinforcements to arrive, if ever. No, we continued past the Pillars of Heracles into the Atlantic Ocean. There was just this one issue. Our ships were running out of supplies, meaning the next port we encountered had to be where we established our colony. This turned out to be the port of Olesipo, hailed by an unknown culture to us. Guess this was it then. If we wanted our colony to succeed, we had to remove these barbarians first. Olesipo was a mighty settlement, which port was heavily fortified with archer towers guarding the coast. It had multiple layers with a major cliffside protecting the town square from naval incursions such as ours. There was also this one narrow road along the cliffside leading directly to the chieftain's hut. This city surely seemed like a challenge. So, in order to make this a bit easier, we sent forth 3 archer ships to burn down one of the towers on this cliffside here. But after realizing how easy it was to set ablaze, we sent out 3 additional ships to sail along the coastline and do the same all the way along the coast. The remaining archer ships would focus down the barbarian cavalry, making the landing of our marines just a tiny bit easier. After phase 1 of the battle, namely the landing and establishing a beachhead, was practically finalized, we began on phase 2, the battle within the streets itself. The Admiral Glaucus led a contingent of marines to block off any barbarians from reaching the beach. It led to an engagement where they were heavily outnumbered and in severe danger due to the hostile cavalry, which gave the barbarians a clear edge against our sword-exclusive marines. But while this was going on, we began ascending the cliffside towards the chieftain's hut. Further down the coast, a large portion of our marines also held off what seemed to be the elite forces of the barbarians. They practically carved through our exhausted units, leading to us deploying our archers with a couple of daggers to outflank them. As we reached the plateau of Lysipo, which resembled the Acropolis of Athens in its own way, we were met by the barbarian chieftain himself along with plenty of other cavalry units. This was a major issue as we didn't really have the quality to break through. The barbarians even got reinforcements by civilians from outside the city, who finally reached the battle. Of course, we got that too from Cleisthenes, who took command of the assault on the plateau, along with the many archers he brought with him. Glaucus was focusing on cleaning up the coastline and those elite barbarian units that previously slaughtered our forces. Once he had done that, we reached the 3rd stage of the assault, namely the plateau. 3 units of our most intact marines contingents were tasked to take the long way up to the plateau, while our new reinforcing archers took position along the cliffside. These archers had only one task: take down the barbarian cavalry. If we succeeded in doing that, nothing would stand in our way. As our flanking marines reached the 3rd level of the city, they met tough resistance by additional reinforcing townsfolk and farmers. Usually this wouldn't have been an issue, but our men were so exhausted that the fighting was quite balanced. Whenever an archer unit ran out of ammunition, they would run around as well to help in this flanking maneuver. The Battle of the Plateau was fierce, with us slowly being pushed back down the cliffside again. But by this point the barbarian chieftain had fallen, meaning once our flanking units finally made it around to encircle the last units, they surrendered. The Battle of Lysipo was a massive success. It was also an incredibly bloody affair, with us losing over 2/3 of our marine corps. Overall, this meant we could now loot the city and take it for our own. The Iberian Wars had begun. A minor handful of warriors from this barbarian tribe we fought escaped further inland, meaning our new colony here outside the Mediterranean was still at risk of being attacked. So Glaucus, the commander in charge of the assault, handed over his remaining units to Cleisthenes for himself personally to take charge of the Athenian ground expansion. Our fleet could only help us to a certain extent. We also needed to give a name to our new colony here. A delegation was sent back to Athens for them to decide what it should be called. However, it will take quite a while for this to be decided, but hopefully it is fitting for our new Hellenic colony. But let's take a look at the diplomatic situation of this new peninsula before we make any decisions on what to do next. This land of hills and forestry was called home by the Iberian tribes known for their guerrilla warfare, formidable warriors and slingers. Clearly, they killed over 2,000 of our marines after all. To the north of us we have the Galati, who apparently are at war with their two eastern neighbors, who supposedly like us due to us occupying Olisipo. South of that we have another conflict where the last tribe bordering us is in a conflict with the Capitani, who were hated by pretty much everyone, even the Carthaginians. All these other tribes didn't really care that we were here, due to so many of our own noblemen being skilled in statecraft. How fortunate. But this status quo wouldn't last forever, as all the crucial resources that made this new landmass so valuable were inland occupied by these other tribes. Conflict was inevitable. There was also this extremely valuable resource down in Western Africa, but we will get to that later. We quickly established a minor force made out of all the available mercenaries in the province, funded by the looting of Olisipo. Furthermore, this Iberian village was to be completely converted with proper Greek infrastructure and also proper defenses. This new settlement will basically become the backbone of this Athenian colony. Another interesting development was the fact that Rome asked us for trade. This was a massive deal, as it potentially meant the Romans wouldn't intervene in our colonization of the West. Let's just hope they don't get involved in Greek affairs, forcing us to fight them. No matter, as the barbarian attacked us once again. But this was definitely not the last time we crossed swords with the Iberian tribes. Nevertheless, we continued our demoralization of Olisipo and began hiring agents to spread our Hellenic faith to other villages and tribes. Like, we even embezzled more gold to recruit new agents. A rebellion also appeared but was crushed by the Celtici tribe to the east of this fine river that marked the border of our individual domains. A fine act of friendship that would have been appreciated if not for the fact that they controlled the best resource of all on this peninsula. So as Glaucus took command, we developed our ground forces made out of local units and constructed a new muster field along with new sacred grounds, an Iberian embassy and a military wharf. Back in Greece, we used this new source of wealth to build a shrine to Poseidon in order to gain favor with the god of the sea. But by the autumn of 269, the Celtici, who we had been eyeing up for quite a while now due to their control of this iron mine, they finally moved out towards one of their many enemies, leaving their precious resources vulnerable, meaning Glaucus could finally begin his expansion. Although we only had a smaller core of Hellenic units in our army, this was far from a weakness. You see, the Iberian units we fielded in our army were specialized in guerrilla warfare, meaning we rapidly had forces inside the town, forcing the garrison to sally out towards Glaucus and his Greek militia. A grave mistake, as our Iberian forces just came tumbling down the same road to charge into their rear. Of course, we immediately looted the settlement, enslaving as many as we could, to then afterwards demolish everything completely. As this gave us control of the entire province, we enacted the noble philanthropy edict, hired a hero for our army, and also recruited more armored units. This huge influx of wealth additionally paid for the new slave trader and improved fisheries we made in Greece. Realizing how rich we could become from this colony alone, we returned to a normal taxation policy, and then also began working on a slave trader here in the new colonies, alongside this shield maker to improve our equipment. If we can fully upgrade our equipment, we might be able to challenge for hegemony over all of Greece, not just the Aegean. But to our surprise, this wasn't the last time we faced the Celtici, as their armies apparently had taken a settlement further inland. We were ready to smite down every last one of them until our statecraft advantages revealed we could just client state the tribe. Perfect. That way we didn't have to march too far away from the sea, which was our true power. Although our navy isn't all that powerful at the moment. But as our new wharves improved, we began reinforcing our fleet again. However, doing this at Olisipo means we can't use proper units in our ground army. We have to rely on the locals for land warfare then. But as the port of Rhodes reached the 3rd tier, we were now able to mass produce these Heptares warships and also put ballistae on our Trirees too. Now this was interesting, but it would take years before they were ready and even reached the colony, and the locals still aren't all that fond of us. They continuously instigated slave revolts, causing great fires in our settlements, and encouraged other tribes to kick us out of Iberia. At least one of them seemed to enjoy our company, even though they are allied with a much larger tribe that just destroyed our client state. I would have marched out to punish them right away, but this other barbarian tribe to the southeast attacked Glaucus at the iron mines. Believing we could crush one army before the other could reinforce, we sallied out with our Greek militia, with our Iberian units being tasked to flank around. Sadly, they got discovered, forcing them to toss their javelins at the barbarian cavalry. Additionally, the hostile reinforcements approached us at a much higher speed than anticipated, leading to Glaucus ordering all of his cavalry to delay their advance. This sally-out maneuver was at the cost of heavy casualties on our Greek units. Nevertheless, our own Iberian units slowly carved their way through the barbarian right flank, allowing us to slowly break their first army. So as our units from the first engagement were able to leave, they rushed over towards the other army that had begun assaulting our own flank. However, after seeing one army completely destroyed, their other commander called for a retreat. Heroically, Glaucus managed to defend our iron mines, with enough men remaining for him to order a counterattack. Finishing off the leftovers was rather easy, with us replenishing our army with mercenaries to then besiege the walled city of Kartuba. And after we refused their peace, they sallied out. Here we used the flexibility of our Iberian forces to isolate and overwhelm the hostiles, allowing Glaucus and the other mounted cavalry to swoop in from the back. A pure slaughter, which resulted in a second heroic victory in a row for Glaucus and his forces of locals. As a result, Kartuba was looted and broken down into tiny pieces. Apart from their sacred grounds, which we began converting into a temple of Artemis. This also meant we officially bordered the Carthaginians, who at this very moment is in full control over Sicily. Luckily, they are too focused on fighting Rome, or else the armies would march against our growing colony. That reminds me that we weren't satisfied with just one colony in Iberia. No, we wanted more. We have heard tales of a large island to the north, as well as a rare amber resource even further away than that. But first we will focus on Western Africa, with their equally rare purple dye resource. So as our new and enhanced ships from Rhodes arrived at the Pillars of Heracles during the summer of 264 BC, Cleisthenes, our naval mastermind, linked up with the reinforcements to then sail down the coast and strike with everything he had. I had no clue of what culture they were from, what deities they worshipped, or overall how powerful they were. This resource just had to be mine. There were two beaches inside the village, divided by this unscalable cliffside, forcing us to divide our forces. On the right, we were quite clever, using our ranged advantage to clear the shores of cavalry to even the odds. On the other hand, the left assault was a pure bloodbath, with our marines experiencing tough resistance from the locals. But it was our new ballistic ships that stole the show of this battle here. Not only did they land magnificent shots in the middle of their hostile lines, but also caused so much chaos many of the natives fled from the battle. But so was also the case for our own marines, who basically all got killed as a result of this. But with all our marines gone, we just sailed our ballistic ships all the way up to the shores, allowing them to shoot from point blank range. Once enough damage had been dealt, Cleisthenes personally landed to finish the task. Although we lost most of the first wave of marines, we prevailed to loot and occupy the port, resulting in us for the first time increasing in Imperium level. Our colonial empire is growing and fast. Another result of reaching a new Imperium level was we could now appoint new governors outside the Greek realm. This will in turn help evolve this colony into a fully Hellenized province. Glaucus returned to the Iron Mines, where he recruited these Scutari spearmen acquired from the Iberian embassy. These units will over time prove to be vital in our success here in Iberia. Apart from getting this extremely valuable resource, this new colony in Africa also meant we got another border with the Carthaginians. Something they definitely didn't appreciate. They are starting to see us as a rival, and likewise we do them. We are gonna monitor their conflict with Rome closely from now on, while we personally focus on getting revenge on the Aravaci for destroying our client state. Tension between us and the Carthaginians grew as a result of one of their politicians seeking refuge inside our new colony. If we accepted this, conflict was sure to erupt, and we couldn't allow that, so we surrendered him to Carthage. We also received the Thorius reform around this time, which was sure to improve our military inevitably. But it didn't have an effect on our forces just yet, as we currently are operating with foreign soldiers in our warfront. This reform must have been triggered by the fact that the Romans took Apollonia, officially entering the Greek realm. For fuck's sake, they know we rely on them to deal with Carthage. We can't afford to retaliate just yet. Let's just hope the Macedonians, who have expanded into Thrace, won't do anything foolish. Even though the Greek realm was being poisoned by the presence of these Roman bastards, the Athenian nobles had their focus elsewhere. Namely this new growing trade union composed of Pergamon, Galatia, Iconian and Ptolemaic Egypt. All nations with favorable opinions of us, but so far had denied our merchants. As a matter of fact, the Egyptians ended their trade agreement with us, and thus challenging our stance of neutrality in any major conflict, such as the one they have with the Seleucids. This was a major concern for us, as Athens, heck even all of the Aegean, was defended by no more than Chremonides our Archon and his ground forces. Nowhere near enough, especially as this Punic conflict was spreading into the seas we controlled. Hence we began working on mustering a new fleet at Crete to safeguard our homeland as well as the trade lanes flowing through the Aegean. Additionally, we established a military training field in Athens to help enhance the capabilities of our statesmen. While tension was brewing back home, a literal war was taking place in Iberia. The Aravaci recently slaughtered our client state. Although they only served us for a short while, it was enough for Glaucus to feel responsible for this. If not at least give us a reason to take their precious resources for our own. So as we passed through Ebora, which quickly had turned into a Hellenic war camp, we hired 3 units of pikemen. As our spies revealed the Iberians were beginning to reinforce the south, we had to act fast, even though it meant moving deeper into this peninsula. So we formed up our formation near this ridge to protect our left flank, while we kept our newly acquired pikemen in reserve to defend the rear. Initially we sent out some of our cavalry to cause chaos, but as we discovered some of the Iberians had weakened their position, we charged. This also meant we entered enemy line of fire, causing massive casualties on our forces, especially the pikemen. Due to this cliffside, the battle basically turned into two separate battles, with the Hellenic forces clearly faring better than our Iberian units. For that reason, Glaucus himself charged straight into the struggle, dismounting and fought alongside his army, inspiring his soldiers to victory. Continuing our tradition, we looted the settlement, increasing our wealth significantly. Furthermore, the settlement gave us access to a new unique Iberian unit to bolster our wounded forces for when the Aravaci would retaliate. This strike showed our resolve and willingness to serve justice, which must have been what encouraged the Egyptians as well as the Seleucids to re-establish trade. Neutrality apparently prevailed, hence we denied their request for a non-aggression pact also. Research-wise, we began working on ways to improve our blacksmith. It was a must if we were to control Greece. Once again, our spies discovered something fascinating. Apparently the Aravaci had all their forces outside of Iberia at a massive port on the other side of the Pyrenees mountains. If there was a port, there was an opportunity for us. So Cleisthenes and his skilled marines reinforced their numbers for the upcoming voyage north. This decision came with a dilemma, as Rome had gained firm control over Sicily. If this trend continued, they would inevitably take control of all of the Carthaginian lands, and we simply cannot allow the Romans to enter Iberia. We had to claim their lands, especially the Pillars of Heracles. Nevertheless, Cleisthenes set sail. We could only imagine the port was being undefended, as their forces were marching south to face Glaucus. But as the Aravaci didn't attack as one army, we used our guerrilla tactics in the hopes of ambushing and overwhelming their smaller force before the second arrived. As we realized they were approaching from the south, we sent down our pikemen to block the streets, preparing to intercept the barbarians. By the time we had destroyed the first army, the other had engaged our forces, meaning there was no time to rest for our guerrilla warriors. All of the Aravaci had committed to combat, Glaucus and his cavalry revealed themselves to smite down the hostile skirmishers. Once that was done, we called out our own to fire straight into the rear of the barbarians. This was so effective, we carved through their forces as if nothing was there, all thanks to our own proper Greek units holding the line, not giving an inch of ground to the enemy. Anyone we captured was enslaved or sold by Glaucus. After the battle, he also gave up command to his son Isocrates, named after the admiral who took Crete. Despite his looks, he was actually no more than 16 years old, meaning this was a heavy burden laid upon his shoulders. Back in Greece, we had by now begun upgrading the housing of both Athens and Hirapitna. Any coin to spare was invested into our new defensive fleet. Economy-wise, it was evident the slave trade almost paid for all our ground forces. Alas, it still had to be supported by our export, which was being boosted by our tariff enhancements, slowly becoming more valuable as we expanded our resource production. But by the winter of 259, the Romans had begun their invasion of Africa, and thus laid siege to Carthage. We had to be ready. But Cleisthenes refused to leave his course. He made his move for the Aravaci port, in the middle of a blizzard. Just like Olisipo, this was a major settlement with watchtowers defending the shoreline. However, at this settlement, the beach was split up into two parts, with the larger of the two being covered with great skirmisher positions and choke points, although this left an easy route towards the town square. Luckily, the Iberians decided to meet us along the shore. Our archer ships tried to burn down their towers but got denied by the blizzard, forcing us to take on the Iberians in melee. Thankfully, our Heptares warships from Rhodes, we almost overwhelmed the Iberians on the beach. However, we didn't land all our marines at this exact beach here. A small handful was sent around into the harbor itself. This would help us deal with the Iberians holding the choke points. Our skilled marines simply outmaneuvered the hostiles, securing us the port in Gallia. Breaking our tradition, we only occupied the settlement. This was mainly because I expected this specific port to be quite isolated. A wholly safe haven perhaps, where merchants would be able to pray before continuing their voyage further north or back home. In order to secure the safety of the settlement even further, we established trade with the local tribes, whose enemies we just defeated. We even established trade with this other Greek colony from the first age of colonization. I feared they could become a rival in the future, but for now, we Greeks had to stand together in these distant lands. This victory of ours left the remaining Aravaci villages in the heart of Iberia. We had to finish them off, so the 16-year-old Isocrates marched out to take on whatever forces they had left. Originally, I kept all my forces on this hill, but after a few moments I realized we were the ones to go on the offensive. For that reason, we ordered some of our cavalry out on the far left. We advanced until our slingers were in range of the hostile skirmishers. However, this was the moment I realized our units actually by accident were perfectly positioned for the oblique order attack, where we would advance on one flank and retreat on the other. The heaviest of our Iberian units hammered into the Aravaci, with our cavalry rapidly approaching from the hills, massively overwhelming that flank. A crucial part of this battle was the fact that a massive gap opened up between our pike corps and right flank, revealing a key path for our reserve cavalry to approach from. This included Isocrates himself, who personally dismounted behind the enemy lines, alongside his bodyguards. Such a crazy maneuver routed all the Aravaci, leading to one of the finest battles in Athenian history. He might only be 16 years old, but Isocrates definitely was a fierce commander, worthy of leading the Iberian regiment. We quickly seized another key resource settlement, which also was the capital of the Aravaci. Surely they sought to take it back with so many forces nearby. We also hoped this meant the Iberians wouldn't march north again, as we used all our gold on constructing sacred grounds and an agora. A rebellion immediately rose as a result of this. However, we just enlisted a new governor, or protector you may call him, who along with the fleet pacified the region. After this, we reinforced our defenses at the major cities in our new colony, for defensive measures only. By now, the jewel of Africa had fallen to Rome. Carthage was sure to crumble now. So this basically meant we had to execute our emergency plan to ensure Rome didn't enter Iberia. We had to secure control over the Pillars of Heracles. However, our ships were all in the north and supposedly didn't intend on sailing south either. Instead, they engaged in combat with a random Gallic faction, where Cleisthenes easily carved through the hostile ships, which didn't stand a chance against our mighty Tryres. Or so was the expectations until the following engagement, where Cleisthenes and his elite marines simply got overwhelmed by the sheer size of the Gallic fleet. Sure, we took down many hostile ships, but the casualties were too expensive. We lost most of our marines in this miserable engagement. We simply weren't ready to venture this far north yet. So we sailed straight back to Olisipo again to replenish. Although our fleet was at last returning south again, we still had to deal with the Aravaci before we could make our move on Carthage. So Isocrates laid a trap with the copper mine as the bait. And sure enough, it worked, with us catching the last true Iberian threat completely off guard. Our ambush was initiated by us releasing fireballs straight into the hostile lines, carving through their ranks, getting a lucky curve, resulting in way more casualties than expected. The Aravaci didn't stand a chance. We captured so many hostiles, we had to expand our slave trader in the colonies. This was possible due to our trade with Macedon, who held Odysseus and its slave resources. Additionally, the Gallic tribe we fought in the north made compelling arguments for peace, which we agreed to. Furthermore, threats of slave revolt started to spread in our new sacred city, though this was resolved by making this sacred city a tax-free settlement, as well as making the stationed fleet return to the waves. After this, we finished off the Aravaci, liberating their last settlement. We established trade with this new tribal ally of ours, but afterwards actually realized this might have had more consequences than anticipated. The Asturies were pretty much hated by the Galaici and our new Gallic trade partners. Nevertheless, we began constructing a temple of Zeus and inevitably also one for Athena up in Gallia. The now proven 17-year-old commander turned into a skilled drill master, making our levies, which was basically our entire army, extremely skilled and capable fighters. Exactly what we needed for our next task. Now we were in a prime position to deal with Carthage, take control of the only way in or out of the Mediterranean, and thus limit the Romans from expanding too far west. We had to break our policy of neutrality. We had to cut them off, so Cleisthenes sailed into the Mediterranean and straight towards the coastal port of Siga. Once again, our mighty armada was at play. Having learned from our previous assaults, we waited to deploy our marines, instead allowing our ballistae and skirmisher ships to demolish the Carthaginians. The hostiles reacted to this by basically abandoning the shoreline, giving us the perfect conditions to land with our marines uncontested. Oh, have I mentioned these Heptares warships from Rhodes also came with Scorpions installed? No? Well, that was a nice addition apart from the larger crew capacity, making assaults such as these way easier. Our marines formed up in this half circle in order to expose the flanks of the hostile defenders, allowing our ballistic ships to line up and fire straight into their lines, with minimal friendly fire. After this heroic victory, we looted and occupied the city, leaving it in ruins. We had officially supported Rome in the Punic Wars, breaking our rule of neutrality. Or more like bending the rule, as the Carthaginians were pretty much defeated already. Our goal here was purely to cut off the Romans. Obviously, we succeeded, meaning the fate of Carthage was now in our hands. We used the salute from Siga to enhance the weaponsmith in Numantia, as well as fortify the defenses of the town. Elsewhere, major events took place. A war had broken out between the Gauls and the controversial tribe we restored to power. It felt like we were caught in the middle of a tense feud, destroying our relations with the Gallic tribes. This conflict was not as tense as the one between the Diadochi, where the Eastern Trade Union just kicked the Seleucids out of the Mediterranean, dissolving our trade with them. Devastating, as they still rejected trade with us. I slowly began considering ways to undermine their goals. Maybe there was a way to steal Ephesus or Side. Who knows? Up in the north, the last Aravaci remnants raided our new sacred lands. Calanus, a former Spartan refugee, who was the defender of this colony, quickly realized any action was futile. Patience was the way forward here. Besides, we had high walls to help protect ourselves. Hence, we allowed the fleet to sail down to help deal with Carthage. A slight mistake, as this encouraged the Aravaci to take this opportunity and strike. We fortified our walls with both skirmishers and hoplites, but the most interesting fact about this battle was the fact that we sallied out with basically all our militia units. Their task was to slow down the ladders for our archers to set them on fire from a distance. However, our plan was slowed down by the Iberians charging straight into our militia. It didn't work for long though, but it was enough for the hostile infantry to arrive, cutting down pretty much all of our units that sallied out. The ladders reached the walls anyway, so it was a complete waste of manpower. We told our archers to fall back, but most got caught in the following battle on the walls. Everything that happened so far would have been terrible if not for the fact that we had several additional ranks of skirmishers on a hill not far from the walls. Once enough Iberians had scaled the walls, we fired everything into their groups, butchering all of them. This was factually the last of the Aravaci. Galana successfully defended the sacred city. Hopefully these Gauls would leave us alone, as we definitely weren't ready to defend ourselves against these numbers. After this, we purchased more slaves to serve in our Iberian mines, followed by Isocrates marching for Mastia to add the citizens to the same task. This could have been Glaucus, but he was back in Athens dealing with certain political issues. However, the really important cities that were the reason we joined this war were the settlements near the Pillars of Heracles. So Cleisthenes struck once again, but you probably know the drill by now. A bunch of skirmishing, our ballistae were causing havoc, and our marines landed to finish the job. An easy battle overall, which actually gave us full control over the entire province of Baetica. An unintended bonus of this attack. Apart from renovating the port, we actually spent the gold on fortifying the colony all the way up in Gaul. We've already witnessed the city being attacked once. We might as well make such an endeavor harder in the future. After that, we enacted the import food edict in Baetica, mainly to encourage growth and expand the available food surplus. Carthage didn't really have all that much left, but what they did have, they used to sack Siga. It was slightly annoying as it basically forced a rebellion in this province. Cleisthenes, however, just sailed back south to defend the port from future attacks. I doubt they would attack again with him around. Furthermore, a new commander was tasked to raise an army of mercenaries and local Mauritanians to deal with the rebellion as well as take Tingis. Meanwhile he did that, Isocrates, the young commander of Iberia, began his siege of Mastia. Back in Greece, we enlisted a champion to infiltrate the trade union in Anatolia to both spy, sabotage and look for non-hostile weaknesses we could exploit. The first thing we realized was the fact that the Seleucids somehow had regained control over Ephesus. If we could take it for our own, we would literally gain another port in the Aegean. So we set sail with the one fleet we had raised at Crete, just ending out of reach. This limitation of movement turned out to be crucial, as we barely missed out on the port. The Iconians took it back with a fleet of their own. Oh, I wanted to smite them down so badly here, but such an attack could have dire consequences. Despite my dark urges for chaos, we remained patient, calculating. Down in Africa, our mercenary army took full control over Mauritania. This province was basically meant to become an industrial hub for many slaves to work in, and thus make Athens incredibly wealthy. Now, all the Carthaginians that left was the Balearic Isles and the city of Mastia, but not for long, as Isocrates gave the orders to attack. We used our guerrilla deployment advantage to have our ladders basically in front of the walls as the battle started. This was done from multiple directions too, meaning we rapidly had forces inside the city. It was only from the north the Carthaginians tried to form a valiant defense. But from the south, we simply overwhelmed their forces, taking the side streets to outflank their reserves. A couple of cavalry units tried to stop us, but were caught by our Scutari spearmen from the Iberian embassy. We basically took control of the town square, leaving us to decide the fate of the city. But as Mastia had no significant value to us, Isocrates merely liberated this port, so we could return back to our colony again. Of course, the Romans weren't all that fond of this, but so be it. During the summer of 256, our relations with the trade union took a major twist, as we abandoned the last Seleucid supporters. This must have been all that kept us outside and away from the Anatolian market. Nevertheless, this didn't stop our schemes on that side of the Aegean. We continued to look for opportunities to gain influence, such as this moment here. For a second time, the Seleucids took control of Ephesus. On this occasion, they had their last Mediterranean fleet prisoned, and unlike the last time, we now had enough movement to reach the Anatolian port. Without hesitation, we attacked. However, this port assault was quite different, as the Seleucids literally had this fleet to defend Ephesus compared to all the other times where there were nothing. Well, kinda, they had to figure out this mess first. And they had plenty of time to do so, as we still were quite far away. That reminds me that we actually split our ballistae ships away from the fleet to barrage the town itself and its garrison. Besides, I doubted they would have made an impact in this following engagement. Our largest Heptares warships immediately boarded the Seleucids, with our smaller fireport ships sneaking in along with the second wave, getting clean ramming opportunities into the stunned ships. Fire spread from one ship to another, with various ships getting ever more entangled with each other. It was evident this battle favored neither side, with both suffering major casualties. Nevertheless, it was the Athenians who came out on top, with the remaining Seleucids willingly jumping into the sea, letting Poseidon decide their fate. This incredible naval battle outside of Ephesus left us with no more than this laughable fleet, if you could even call it that. But there was no chance we abandoned our pursuit of Ephesus now, leaving it in the hands of Iconian and the trade union again, not after everything we sacrificed. We increased the tempo of our barrages. The Seleucids retaliated by burning down one of the ballistae, forcing our marines to finish the task, which they barely pulled off. But Ephesus was ours. As it was already a Greek settlement, we simply occupied the port, giving us more influence of Anatolia than ever before. This assault left our fleet in ruins. It would take quite a while before it would return to full strength. With the Punic Wars all but over, we continued to develop Greece, an endeavor which required quite a lot of food. This was planned to be produced in Iberia, but so far was failing to meet our requirements. We had to colonize more land, for farming of course. So we prepared our ships once more for the voyage north. This time, we wouldn't fail. But while those preparations were being made, Glaucus had played politics in Athens to seal the names of our new colonial settlements such as New Athens, Glaucia, Artemida, Heraklion, and more importantly Diospolis, or sacred settlement in Gallia. Not only that, but due to the Romans meddling with the Greek realm, Glaucus also convinced Chremonides, the Athenian archon, to muster an army to defend all of Greece, and more importantly, Athens itself. We encouraged the state to focus on slavery, which caused quite a lot of rebellions to erupt in Iberia, dissolved taxation law for Ephesus and Rhodes, as well as helped stabilize the marketplace. This major focus on slavery apparently caused some political issues, which forced our hands to free hearts for spoils of war. This had the consequences of a reduced population output and major public order issues throughout the colonies. But so be it. After that, we began sending gifts and praising politicians of the party Cleisthenes was part of to ensure loyalty and eventually a political marriage. But the downside to this, in order to make sure people didn't look on Glaucus and his family as tyrants, he actually ordered his wife to assassinate their son-in-law, framing it on Iberian refugees, and thus scoring sympathy for their political party, keeping them as one of the most beloved parties in Athens. His son Isocrates, on the other hand, was tasked to deal with this slave uprising that just sacked Artemida. Rather easily, he forced the rebellion to hide in the hills. He defeated most of them, but a few managed to escape. However, it was at the second encounter with this slave revolt we discovered something incredible. Apparently, all of these public order issues and slave uprisings were both organized and funded by Rome. More precisely, this guy here, Secundus Nigidius Labo. The Romans had played us, tricked us into trade agreements while they secretly undermined our goals from the shadows. First they seized settlements in Greece, and now this treason. We broke our law of neutrality just to leave the Romans without anyone to keep them in check. Surely a punishment by the gods. We should never have supported Rome. Not only had the Romans betrayed us, causing rebellions in Iberia, but they were also advancing into Illyria towards our trade partners. Here they absolutely obliterated the Darosi, who foolishly fought an uphill battle, getting completely destroyed in the process. This was terrible, as trade counted for a huge chunk of our revenue. We had to act, and fast, especially as Athens was this close to the front line. Subjugating the other Greek states was a must for the protection of our capital. Luckily for us, Cremonidus had established this new army. It marched straight for Larissa during these times of intense conflict. Unlike the Iberian regiment, this army was based on proper Athenian hoplites and veterans. It had the support of a couple of Corinthian spearmen and Cretan archers, along with the same cavalry units from the Aegean Wars. So as you could expect from fighting other civilized nations, this battle was way more tactical than the others we had fought so far in the colonies. So let's split it up, starting with phase 1, where the vanguard composed of Corinthians and Cretans were tasked to scout ahead, while the hoplite corps formed up in the hills. The terrain was extremely rugged, with small clusters of trees surrounding the upcoming battlefield. Here an initial ranged skirmish took place, with our Cretans being far superior. However, we swiftly switched targets to these phalanx units that straight up ran towards us. They engaged with our Corinthians, but were far from the only focus of attack. For instance, on the left we deployed all our cavalry to counter the Thessalians, completely neglecting the right. Thankfully, this flank was protected by our Greek veterans. The pressure from all sides was immense, with the uneven terrain further complicating the battle. At one point the center even routed due to the hoplite phalanxes, forcing us to close this major gap with our Cretan archers. Luckily, their heavy armor made them adequate to such a task, and although the right was heavily contested, we still managed to send units over the hills to outflank the Thessalians. Additionally, we completely smashed the left engagement, giving us an opportunity to send in Cremonidus and thus take down anyone stuck in combat. This left us with phase 3, where a large portion of the hostiles actually disengaged to regain their stamina. Every now and then they sent forth a unit or two, but our more skilled warriors easily dispatched their efforts. Once we had dealt with the main engagement, we rested up in between the hills, contemplating whether this internal war was worth it or not, with the warmongering Romans at our doorstep. Nevertheless, we followed through with our attack, subjugating Larissa to form a buffer state between Athens and Rome. Cremonidus returned home to replenish, preparing to invade the Peloponnese. In the meantime, let's focus on Iberia. Other than the countless rebellions being instigated by Rome, we manned our ships to sail north in search of new farmland. Furthermore, we solely researched siege technology to both prepare for the inevitable attack on Carthage and Rome. Not to forget, it was necessary to maximize our blacksmiths. Oh, and just to confirm, although the Carthaginians refused peace, our war efforts against them was all but over. Perhaps our upcoming actions might sway them to favor us again. Nevertheless, by the spring of 253, our fleet set sail from New Athens towards the Bosporus, where Cleisthenes joined up with Glaucus, who once again would be in charge of our colonization efforts. From here, they sailed past the Gallic tribe Cleisthenes previously fought, inevitably reaching this distant island. Of course, these barbarians refused to do this the easy way, meaning we had to teach them the way of the Olympians. I bet they never even imagined a massive armada would show up to set their ports on fire. We literally incinerated their defensive units with our ranged ships. The Marines also trapped a large portion on this passage along the cliffside, giving our ballistic ships these massive targets to aim for. Overall, it was rather easy. We looted the settlement so we could spend the gold on upgrading the blacksmith at Glaucia to its third and final tier. It turned out this new island was known as the land of the Britons. A rather xenophobic people only trading with each other, but despising and even campaigning in Gaul and these lowlands to the east. But as it appears, we only occupied a smaller fishing village, with the main Britannic forces either being at the capital or in Gaul itself. With that, let's go back to Greece. Here, as we had replenished our ranks and was all but ready to march in and subjugate Sparta, a rebellion rose at Crete. We quickly set sail to finish them off. But the reason I'm telling you this is because this gave me an idea. Our main source of strength was clearly the sea, but as Sparta was a city further inland, we couldn't really use this advantage of ours, unless we could lure them to the coastline. We tried to do that by raiding their lands right here. Sadly, miscommunication spoiled this plan, with the fleet not being ready to reinforce. Cremonides made a hasty retreat hoping to enter the defensive range of Athens, but was short-handed, meaning he had to take on all the Spartan forces alone. This was quite an uphill battle, literally. We tried to secure it with our vanguard, but quickly realized that the Spartans were all over it. After a rather short skirmish, they began chasing us, meaning our vanguard returned to the main army that formed up on more even ground. As we realized it was mostly skirmishers that chased us, we sent out our cavalry to deal with it. As the Corinthians joined this minor engagement, it was evident that we tactically outperformed them here. That was our reality until we looked upon the hill a second time. This time with twice as many Spartans, all running straight for our rather stretched out lines. Although our veterans held strong on the right, the center was massively outmatched, with both of the Spartan rulers leading the charge there. It was no surprise this was where our lines broke first. Cremonides charged in to hold the line, but was no match for the superior Spartan forces, as he was surrounded from all sides, and as all the horses ran away, the Athenian Archon fell to the ground. Only a few veterans managed to escape to tell the tale. The governor of Mauritania became the new Archon. Lycus, one of the many Athenian statesmen, took charge of what was left of the army. After the defeat, we ordered the fleet to defend our capital, while Lycus, the new commander, mustered new troops. The Britannic expedition was no less intense, with both Athenian fleet sailing straight for this major barbarian stronghold. Funny enough, the settlement actually looked just like how New Athens was organized back in the day. However, unlike in Iberia, this port had way more defenders, meaning we had to use every tool available to us. For instance, apart from solely using our ranged capabilities to rinse the beach of savages, we tasked one of our ballistic ships to create a gap in their so-called walls further inland, with the intention of outflanking the Britons. But as we eventually landed on the shore, it was as if our marines had no chance. They got absolutely destroyed by their chariots of theirs. Eventually we dismantled them, but by then we had suffered major casualties. The main assault was wiped out by the time we breached the walls. So as we sent forth our 4 largest groups, we literally drew the attention of the entire city. This meant we could land with basically all our skirmishers, hoping for at least one of them to reach the town square. After a bit of time, both Cleisthenes and Glaucus reached the top, helping to secure it and thus winning the battle. After this engagement, quite a lot of barbarians escaped, forcing us to enlist a sizable portion of mercenaries to defend our newly acquired lands. The next season, as both plagues and rebellions hindered our plans, Glaucus took command to pacify the mainland. Cleisthenes was tasked to blockade Gaul and thus deny any reinforcements from arriving. A blockade the barbarians were more than willing to test. As we discovered how large the barbarian fleet actually was, we immediately sailed backwards. This was done hoping to get their ships closer together. This meant we could ram into one ship at a time without the others interfering. Overall, this was one of the most satisfying victories in Cleisthenes' career, writing him into the history books as one of the finest naval commanders. Despite our success, a smaller fleet still made it through to sack one of our colonies. It would later be taken by rebels, no matter, as we just defeated the Britannic fleet to then afterwards take back the port again. By now we had absolutely devastated southern Britannia with probably the worst public order in the entire world. Nevertheless, our goal here was purely to secure new farmland in preparations for a confrontation with Rome. Not thinning out our numbers, meaning we negotiated a peace with the Iceni. Now we just needed to rebuild. The Spartans also requested peace, but their fate was sealed. Speaking of Greece, as we didn't have any cavalry regiments of our own, we had to buy mercenaries to support our army. As we marched into Lacedaemon, we realized just one of their 2 armies were defending their capital. There was no better time to strike than now. I must admit, Sparta was a fine settlement, This must be why they chose to fight outside the streets. Unexpectedly, instead of engaging our forces, they actually drifted to the side, allowing our Cretan archers to pick them off without pressure. However, it was during this skirmish we discovered a massive host of Spartans approached from the north. Immediately we ordered our veteran hoplites to screen this approach, while the main army engaged this minor force. A small portion of Corinthians were tasked to seize control of the town itself. Once again, our archers served a key purpose as they took up a position on the left flank to fire into the Spartans from this flank and rear. In the meantime, our entire front line was engaged. The struggle in the middle was by far the most intense, as this was where one of the Spartan rulers led his 300 bodyguards. They absolutely annihilated our inferior hoplites, isolating just 2 units of veterans on the far right. We feared this was about to turn into another defeat by the Spartans, until we discovered the mercenary cavalry began making real charges all across the battlefield. In the end, it was just the Spartan ruler who kept on fighting. But like the rest, we eventually finished him off. We had successfully subjugated the 2 neighboring city-states in Larissa and Sparta. But what about Macedon? I know we have had friendly relations so far ever since our independence from them in 273. But if Macedon aligned with Rome, they would have the power they so desperately lacked to stop us back then. An opportunity for revenge. Same could be said for the Eastern Trade Union. Only if they betrayed us, we would be starved of income. One last colony had to be established to secure revenue for this inevitable conflict. We began mustering a fleet at Crete to strengthen our grip on the Mediterranean. But with that said, what about Carthage? Their Numidian subjects were all but destroyed by the Romans, who had marched into the desert fighting a Pyrrhic victory to overcome the skirmisher-focused Macedon. Due to our focus on neutrality, this conflict might be a lot harder than we expect. Establishing our final colony was a rather tedious affair. Basically, we just lured these native barbarians out to the coastline to crush their forces with our ballistic ships. This single road turned into a literal graveyard, with dozens upon dozens of bodies being stacked here. It was an exhaustingly close victory, and the beginning of our rather extensive conflict with these barbarian tribes known as the Germanic people. However, this story deserves its own video, meaning you won't hear about this expedition for quite a while. Instead, let's go back to our capital, where tension between us and the Romans was larger than ever before. They already controlled land in both Greece and Africa, but their Massalian allies in Gaul basically served as an extension of their will, having conquered most of Gaul slowly surrounding Diospolis, our sacred city. Same could be said for Antigonus Gonatas, the ruler of Macedon, who had led a massive host through their already subdued Thracian holdings, all the way into Illyria and Dacia. Our situation was getting worse by the second. Most of our colonies were in outroar, forcing us to send multiple statesmen on diplomatic missions to enhance public order. It was rather expensive, slowing down the construction of our highly desired fleets. On the other hand, we at last established peace with the Carthaginians in hiding at the Balearic Isles, allowing their merchants to trade at our many ports. Fortunately for us, the Romans had pissed off the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, starting a major conflict in northern Africa, where the Romans used superior siege equipment and technology to breach the walls of Cyrene and sack the city. This attack made the Romans extremely rich, but also distracted them from their western and Greek borders. And with Antigonus Gonatas in Dacia, this was the perfect time to strike, if he wanted a chance to succeed at least. So by the spring of 264 BC, as the Macedonian raiding party was harassing our trade lanes, we retaliated, starting the Mediterranean War. Or Second Punic War, depending on how you look at it, with us switching sides. But don't worry, we Athenians would never initiate this massive conflict without a plan of attack. Glaucus, the now most senior and experienced commander in the entire nation, had returned to Athens, where he took command of the defenders of Greece's army, with the intention of setting sail straight past the almost impregnable city of Pella into Thrace, hoping to crush the Macedonian economy before the massive host of Macedonians returned from their campaign in the north. This would obviously leave Athens vulnerable with only our client states to defend it. However, this was where our unrivaled naval power was gonna prove its value. We would use our newly constructed fleet to kick the Romans out of Greece. Such a strike would definitely cause a reaction from the devious neighbor of ours. Hence we had also formed a new fleet at New Athens. Although it was inferior to our other fleets, it had the most difficult task in securing Caralis. This was vital as we could straight up cut off the Roman forces from Africa, meaning Glaucus only had to worry about the Macedonians. Additionally, the Massalian puppets joined the war shortly after, meaning our sacred city was on high alert. Luckily, we already had a massive host to defend the city, as well as Socrates, the famed commander from the Iberian Wars, on standby in case the situation developed out of hand. With that said, let's begin the conflict at Apollonia, where our mighty ballistae blasted the shit out of the Romans, forcing them to abandon the town, allowing us to liberate the fallen Epirote kingdom to defend the western coast. After the battle, we took a quick look at the city of Taris, but figured such an attack was useless without replenishing. We established trade with the other Greek nations and actually tried to do the same with the Iceni, as I feared they would jump on our weakened state. But they refused, making us fear for the worst. This was mainly why Cleisthenes stayed in Britannia instead of turning to this large-scale conflict across the Mediterranean. Also, it didn't take long for our fears to become a reality. Basically, this is the lay of the land now, with us having 4 different theaters of war. 5 if you count the colonization efforts in Germania. Originally, the plan was to have the colony founded already, so it could fund our war efforts against the Romans and Macedonians. But the resistance from the Germans proved to be more challenging than expected, leaving us mostly reliant on Mauritania and Greece itself. They had to be protected at all cost. Some good news was that the Macedonian ally in Dendari, despite being a landlocked nation, feared our power so much they actually switched sides, becoming a client state of ours. This was huge, as it literally denied the Macedonians from taking the short and easy route back to Thrace. This came at the perfect time, as Glaucus reached Macedonian shores uncontested, meaning he could lead the defenders of Greece straight to Apollonia Pontica, where he split his infantry into 3 separate groups to spread out the attack, with his cavalry all the way on the left. This meant once the battle began just outside the town, our cavalry rushed in, taking out the defending skirmishers, allowing our spearmen to box in the rest. By now these lands had already been Hellenized, meaning we merely occupied the settlement. This fact also allowed us to replenish our purely Greek army. This conquest unintentionally also granted us vision over the western part of the Black Sea, meaning we could establish trade routes with both the Scythians and Cimmerians. Nevertheless, Glaucus continued his lightning strike, securing the crucial slave resource from Odysseus, with the fleet defending Apollonia. From here we discovered the Macedonians were rapidly approaching Thrace, fighting their way through Dacian and Illyrian territory to get back and defend their holdings. If the Dacians held the line for long enough, we might actually be able to take the fortification of Philippopolis. To ensure the barbarians were willing to assist our cause, we arranged a marriage between our 2 faction leaders, even though our own faction leader was quite old in comparison. This would help strengthen our ties and perhaps even secure the north, despite this being arranged with non-Greek savages. Further west, the Romans seemed to have legions marching through the desert. But you know what they say in chess? If your opponent is attacking on the flanks, counterattack through the middle, which we did with this assault on Caralis. But unlike our many other fleets, this one actually didn't have any ballistae ships, meaning we were tactically limited to a direct assault through the heavily fortified port. A head-on assault. It began with us burning down the defensive ballistae emplacements, meaning we could cruise into the port itself, where no more than 3 of our ships could offload their marines at a time. This was an incredibly brutal assault with hundreds of our marines dying on the sand. A single unit heroically passed through the initial engagement, halting the approach of the rest of the city militia, meaning as more of our own units landed, the more ground we had gained. As the assault progressed, we lured the Massalians back into the port, where we could surround and finish off whatever units they had left with our skirmishers and overwhelming numbers in confined space. Overall, it was a close victory that allowed us to occupy this strategically crucial port. Of course, with the many casualties we sustained, we had to rebuild our fleet. With this position, we were able to intercept several Roman army transports such as this attack here, where our ships formed up in two ranks. Here it was only the first rank that approached the Romans, ramming one transport to then quickly sail deeper into the Roman lines, all the way until their ships sailed no more. Once the battle was over, the fleet merely returned to Caralis, where they would wait for other opportunities to strike. Mostly we avoided the Massalian fleet, but whenever the Romans exposed themselves, we swiftly reacted with decisive strikes. Even their proper ships weren't enough to rival our superior power. That was the case until the third interception, where we caught 2 armies worth of transports as well as a minor fleet sailing for Greece. We used the same 2 ranks as from the first battle, but after slicing through the first army, our first line split up into 2 parts, one to deal with the proper fleet, and another dealing with the remaining transports. This turned out to be a mistake, as this actually allowed the Romans to overwhelm our ships on both engagements, forcing us to activate our second line. The last Roman transports were more densely formed, meaning we could simply surround them. Once a transport isolated itself, we rammed it, taking out the rest one by one. Despite our incredible victory, which probably saved Greece from a Roman invasion, our casualties were severe enough for our fleet to stand down for quite a bit. Especially as the money we usually spent on rebuilding the fleet was being invested into the northern colonies. Ever since the Iceni declared war on us again, we plotted to kick them out of Britannia entirely. By this point we had accumulated 1 complete army. Combine that with this smaller mobile militia and Cleisthenes' fleet to patrol the coastal settlements from potential Iceni naval raids, we could actually take the last Iceni settlement, gaining more farmland in the process. From here, the plan was to mobilize a large-scale invasion from Britannia into Gaul itself, defeating the Iceni for good, and then moving on to the Massalians, who by now were roaming the lands of Diospolis. Time was of the essence. Speaking of time, back in Thrace, the Macedonians were running full force through Dacia, burning their towns and villages in the process. We had to take Philippopolis, and fast, if we were to have a chance to survive these numbers. We took it after a prolonged siege just in time as well, as our Dacian allies were down to just 1 settlement. This complicated things, as we now were allied through matrimony. We couldn't just sit around letting them be destroyed. Neither did we have the numbers to handle all the Macedonian numbers on the field. Of course, the original plan was for this swift strike through Thrace to cripple the Macedonians, but their own expedition into Illyria had given them enough land to resist our scheme. So we escalated our attack with a second fleet blockading Pella and thus denying them trade. Diplomatically, we pulled off another trick by persuading another of the Macedonian client states in the north to betray the overlords. All because they feared our strength. Sadly, our blockade was tested shortly after it was formed. Here the Macedonians outsmarted us, attacking the fleet from 2 separate directions. We turned all our largest ships to face theirs, while the smaller ships dealt with their transports. But where one engagement was going swimmingly, the other was devastating. Our Heptares warships were too slow, allowing the Macedonians to sail around and ram our ships into ruin. Even our flagship holding our admiral was destroyed. Eventually the smaller ships returned to finish off the rest, but by that point we had lost way too many ships and marines. It didn't stop us from blockading the capital though, but we had to be very careful after that. Glaucus on the other hand was getting ready to march into Dacia, up until our barbarian client Barrier State told us the Macedonians had passed through their lines entering Thrace. We sent out the same champion who previously was spying in Anatolia to discover most of the Macedonians were far closer than expected. We had to make a choice of either fighting at Philippopolis or marching north to save the Dacians. We had successfully executed the plan we set out to perform, but now it was the Macedonians who were on the offensive. Although our blockade narrowly endured the first Macedonian counterattack, the second strike was too risky to stop. We were already spending all our gold on replenishing the central fleet at Caralis, meaning losing this one too would be terrible. We retreated back to Athens so we could reinforce our fleet, allowing the Macedonians to trade once again. This also meant Glaucus was all alone in Thrace, where a major local slave uprising occurred during the tiring winter, making his decision to either march north and save our Dacian allies or staying within the fortification to fight the Macedonians more difficult. It didn't help that Antigonus Gonatas marched through our lands, threatening both outcomes as well as Odysseus, possibly making the walls of Philippopolis useless. The slave resource was crucial for our economy, meaning it had to be protected at all cost. But this wasn't our only war front. As a matter of fact, we had already initiated our first stages of our invasion of Gaul from the Britannic colonies, given the orders for Isocrates and his extremely experienced forces to march for Diospolis, saving it from Massalian raiding parties, and also struggled with additional Roman-funded rebellions at Sardinia, who used their large numbers to make ladders and assault Caralis, the all-important port that cut the lines between Italy and Africa. So the fact that the rebels stormed the walls and flooded into the streets itself was a huge threat. We quickly deployed our militia units hoping to slow down the rebels, while the marines landed. The most brutal part of the battle was at the outskirts of the city, where we trapped most of the enemies in this open space. We used our limited cavalry to flank along the edge of the city, but they quickly got overrun, allowing the rebels to grind through our militia units. Once our marines reached the struggle, it was too late. The battle was over, and the port was sacked along with the fleet set on fire. To our surprise, they didn't occupy the port, but merely continued to raid the rest of the island. This was obviously a major loss, intensifying the threat on Greece. We had to rebuild our fleet at New Athens, but more urgently make sure the Romans didn't divert any units from Africa over to the other frontiers. Hence Zenobius, the man tying our alliance with the Dacians together, advanced from his otherwise defensive position in Mauritania towards the city of Carthage. By doing this, we also formalized our alliance with Carthaginians for a minor fee. This inspired the morale of our African forces, allowing them to seize Iole by razing the shit out of it. A couple of constructions was ordered to be made in an effort to avoid slums to develop. Nevertheless, we suffered quite a lot of casualties from performing this attack, forcing us to halt our offensive. Taking settlements wasn't important anyways. Drawing the attention of Rome was all that mattered. In the meantime, let's focus on the northern offensive, where the assault on this Gallic port began. Despite the settlement being occupied by Britannic tribes who sailed across the channel to get there, they only had 2 ships left to slow down our own trireme. They didn't stand a chance with us boarding their ships from the front to then ram the hostiles from the side. With the ships gone, we began the bombardment of the garrison, set their buildings on fire, and overall performed suppressing fire while our marines landed just outside the town. The Iceni quickly reacted, but was so disorganized in their defensive measures it just made for easy targets. Our marines pinned down the garrison in this choke, forming this even larger cluster of men. Overall, it was a bloodbath where we heroically captured the port, establishing a beachhead in Gallia from the north. We immediately began converting the town into a supply depot, in preparation for the upcoming arrival of the Britannic forces, who by accident weren't in position to depart just yet, mainly due to the looming threat of the northern Britannic tribes. At the same time, the situation back home had developed for the worse. Not only had more Macedonian forces returned to Thrace, but also a lesser force had covertly subdued the western coastline again, including Apollonia defeating one of our allies. This caused a massive outrage in Athens, with 2 political parties, including Cleisthenes, threatening to break away from our rule. And just for your interest, both parties held land in Iberia. So as Isocrates had marched towards Gaul, we had no armies to appease the situation. We had to deal with this through intrigue and a lot of gold, which we had plenty of due to Glaucus sacking Stoboi. However, all this did was isolate our army. Antigonus Gonatas nearly caught Glaucus and his Greek forces, but they just about managed to escape. It wasn't all bad though. You see, the rebellion at Sardinia underestimated their own strength on multiple occasions, merely sacking the port of Caralis whenever they attacked. So when our Carthaginian allies somehow landed at the shores, we actually pacified the island, keeping it under Athenian control. Furthermore, the Egyptians had liberated one of the Libyan tribes in northern Africa. This new nation was so desperate for trade they accepted becoming a client state. Additionally, our scheme to lure the Roman forces away from Greece worked, meaning we just left Iole in rubbles, retreating back to the more defendable Mauritanian colony. This development made me confident we could defend the south, persuading me to go on the offensive in Gaul, with Isocrates merging his Iberian levies with the Gallic levies, forming a sweet blend of both cultures, making both armies extremely flexible in combat. This also meant neither army had any decisive strength, but this fact was overlooked, as we wanted to advance on the Massalians. Isocrates marched straight for the former Ivernic capital only to find a Greek army stationed there. He opted to march for Lemonum instead and possibly link up with the Athenian armies invading from Britannia. The other army led by Galenus attacked Tolosa just east of the Ospolis, where the Greeks sallied out to face our varied army in the field. We kept our Greek militia in the center to keep a firm front line supported by the Gallic swordsmen and Scutari spearmen. On the flanks we had our Iberian swordsmen and skirmishers to rush around the flanks and thus overwhelm the Massalians on all fronts. It was clear we would win the battle, but the lack of a proper strength showed itself with us suffering quite a lot of casualties, again in this dragged out contest. However, we just refilled our army with local mercenaries. Up in the north, a few of our Britannic forces finally made it across the channel. They silenced a minor rebellion and began recruiting cavalry units to help our invasion plans that were going quite well, until the Massalians reacted to our offensive. Down in Tolosa, the Massalians immediately counterattacked with 2 complete armies. As they were attacking from 2 directions, we planned to smash one army at a time, just like we had done back in Iberia so long ago. However, not only did it take forever for us to break this first army, but also we didn't have any units capable of holding back the second army, meaning they just overwhelmed the town garrison on that side. We tried to take it back, but was easily repelled. As quick as we had taken Tolosa, the faster it was lost again. Isocrates on the other hand didn't want to accept the offensive was a failure and thus continued his push north. But what he had forgotten was taking his settlement didn't actually connect him to the northern invasion, meaning he now was completely surrounded in hostile territory. Over in Greece, the pressure from the Macedonians was ramping up, with Antigonus Gonatas now encamping within our border, as well as having other armies march into Dacia. We had to save our ally, so Glaucus left half of his Greek forces in the hands of Lycus, the former commander of the same army Glaucus now leads. This force was intended to defend our own Thracian holdings, while Glaucus himself marched for Odysseus to recruit local units for the expedition into Dacia. However, this decision proved to be fatal, as Glaucus immediately seceded, with most of central Iberia following in his footsteps. This allowed the Macedonians to besiege Philippopolis. Our plan to assist the Dacians was instantly shelved in favor of returning to lift the siege. Zenobius, who was eagerly waiting for the Romans to enter Mauritania, was now forced to leave Africa in favor of liberating central Iberia. These lands weren't all that necessary anymore. The lands neither provided any meaningful income, nor were they needed to sustain our supply lines anymore. But what they did impact was the safety of our trade ships sailing from Greece to the Britannic Isles and the Germanic shores. Furthermore, these colonies served as a beacon of this new colonial age. This conflict had to be solved, and fast. Hence, the Athenian Archon attacked the defending forces at Heracleon. This fog was nerve-wracking, making the elephants uneasy. Our Numidian scouts eventually discovered parts of the treacherous army performing hit-and-run maneuvers to lure them out into the open field. Zenobius placed his army on this high ground position just to realize he had been deceived. A second force was rapidly approaching from the bottom of the hill to the left. This shifted an otherwise simple squashing tactic into one forced into splitting its army up. One minor regiment would hold the ridge, while the rest, along with the elephants, charged down the hill. The elephants proved to be crucial in this engagement, aiding to break one army completely. Over on the ridge, we encircled the more elite forces with our slingers firing into the rear of the hostiles. This caused a reaction, with parts of the enemy force splitting off to chase them, but our cavalry simply hammered into them, breaking the back of this secessionist army. Over time, Zenobius would re-establish democracy to central Iberia again. Same could be said for Thrace, where Glaucus barely made it back in time to lift the siege, and immediately afterwards served justice upon the traitors who betrayed our own country in favor of the Macedonians. This act of justice sparked a bit of hope in the Athenian armies that were suffering from this large-scale conflict. However, it was immediately extinguished by the Editani, who seemingly had had enough of our presence in their peninsula, starting yet another conflict. To make matters worse, 3 Massalian armies were approaching Diospolis. Although it was able to withstand a siege once in the past, it would surely crumble under this pressure. Thus, despite the forces from Britannia mobilizing to reach the south and reinforce, Isocrates fully upgraded his units with the finest equipment in the world to then march out towards this river crossing in the hopes of luring the Greeks away from Diospolis all alone. However, as a result of this impulsive action, Isocrates now found himself surrounded by 4 armies. Our agents tried to hinder one army to slightly balance the odds, but failed. Initially, the Massalians actually refused to cross the bridge, but whether they expected a trap or something was beyond my knowledge. However, this allowed us to focus all our forces on the single army approaching from the same side of the river that we were on. This was a bloody battle where the weather just made it so much worse. Our own flexible army was quite handy in this situation, as this first engagement developed into multiple minor struggles. But that was all part of the Massalian tactic to defeat us. With our army split up into multiple engagements, their massive host crossed the river, almost catching our scout that kept an eye on them. We couldn't wrap up the fighting in time, leaving us with only our Gallic javelin men and Isocrates himself to fend off the over 4,000 strong force. It was a slaughter, and as Isocrates fell, the remaining army routed. Our invasion of Gallia from the south was completely wiped out, with Diospolis now getting besieged. To our fortune, the Massalians only used a minor force to surround the city, meaning we just sallied out to chase them away. With that, we immediately reinstated the Stratos 1 army and began mustering new forces. And although we were in position to attack from the north, we now chose to stand down for a bit longer, as we didn't want to send in a 3rd army to its demise. Reinforcements from Britannia were on their way after all. It felt like the only proper commander Athens had left was Glaucus, and his half-Greek, half-Thracian army prepared an ambush to lure the Macedonian ruler into a battle. However, as we arrived at the intended battle site, scaling the massive hillside to organize the ambush, we found the Macedonian forces already there and in formation. Glaucus immediately reorganized his troops, preparing them for combat, sending all the Thracians to the right flank, hoping to shock them in a single charge. As Antigonus Gonatas ordered the Macedonians to attack, our archers engaged, killing dozens, while our Greek front line slowly marched forward. As planned, the right flank inevitably crushed the opposition, paving the road for success. This was a sweet victory, easing the tension on Greece, even though we couldn't chase down Antigonus, leaving him at large. Nevertheless, Glaucus now marched for Dacia, while a second force was raised at Athens. Up here, he largely managed to intercept Macedonian army marching for our allies, but suffered heavy casualties in the process, meaning he also had to fall back again. Over in Iberia, the Editani were on the move, conquering the Galatae, our trade partner. But this opened up a new opportunity for us, because if you look back at this war so far, there has been a clear pattern. With a good commander, our armies were mediocre at best. But at sea, on the other hand, our navies were supreme. So while we may not be able to completely wipe out their settlements further inland, we could possibly seize control of their coastal ports, of which there were plenty, to then strangle their economy, easing the workload for our ground forces a bit. If we were to win this war, the Mediterranean had to be ours. So we called for Cleisthenes to return south, just like the second fleet at the Black Sea. Our new plan started in Iberia, where the fleet that originally was supposed to reach Caralis now changed course towards the Editani capital, as their armies apparently were on the other side of the peninsula. Taking the port was quite easy. We just had to slice through whatever inferior fleet they had sailing around their shores. Honestly, their ships had more in common with fishing boats rather than proper warships, meaning they were easily swept aside to then assault the port itself. This conquest also allowed our army defending the copper mines to muster new units. Cleisthenes, on his voyage south, also attacked a couple ports along the way, albeit it resulted in more casualties than expected, but nowhere near as many as we suffered at the Battle of Terraco. Here we engaged this magnificent city with our usual suppressing tactic, to then land our marines so they could do the rest. However, for some unexpected reason, our largest ships didn't reach the shore so our men could disembark, but instead turned around, forsaking our entire campaign strategy in favor of a life as pirates in the Mediterranean. They would never be heard from again. This left our assault with just 3 marine units and our skirmishers. Thankfully, due to our ballistic ships, we overcame this unexpected betrayal, albeit being with heavy losses. Despite our many casualties, this was a massive victory for us. As for assault, we increased in Imperium, allowing us to field way more armies and fleets. They did have this massive army marching for our copper mines, but we just hired a couple of mercenaries to even the odds. Dare I say, the tides are turning. Our amphibious assaults along the eastern coast of Iberia were a massive success. The fire and smoke served as a warning to anyone who dared side with the Romans. It basically said, stand down or suffer the consequences. The Editani only had one settlement left in the far west, isolated from the other towns in Iberia. Taking it would be challenging, especially as the Iceni raided our trade routes with whatever ships they had left. Dealing with them also seemed like an issue, with an army marching north to challenge us. But that was why we sent down reinforcements from Britannia, albeit being a rushed voyage across the channel causing attrition for our men. But by now the Macedonians seemed to be on the verge of capitulation. Actually, Antigonus had already offered us peace so we could focus our armies on Rome itself. But if we agreed to that, our Cretan allies would be the ones to suffer, making our decision quite easy. The Editani, however, still had one card left to play in besieging Numantia, or copper mine in Iberia. But this was a battle we had prepared for by forming barricades and digging spike traps to help in our defense. The Iberian cavalry ran head-on into our barricades, allowing our skirmishers to pick them off with ease, while the infantry corps of the hostiles funneled through the middle of the town into the marketplace, just like we planned. We immediately sprung the trap, sending out our many swordsmen to cut off any escape route and close in. We inevitably encircled the entire army, causing a chain rout. Luckily for them, we were taking captives, enslaving hundreds of men to work in our Mauritanian industrial complex. But unlike the warfronts in Iberia and Thrace, the Massalians on the other hand still posed a threat. They just recaptured Lemonium, officially reverting everything to how it was before our little incursion happened. If we were to make another attempt, we'd require a fleet to cut off their sea access. But with ours mostly destroyed due to complications, this specific frontier had come to a stalemate. Instead, Glaucus actually had plenty to do over in Thrace. After his minor involvement in Dacia, a Macedonian army had snuck past our border patrols and camping within our lands. Not willing to advance on a fortified position with an exhausted army, he chose to replenish his army at Philippopolis. This was fine. We simply waited for our two fleets in the Aegean to resupply for their expedition into the Adriatic, where both Macedonian and Roman ports alike could be found. So according to our new war strategy, the Adriatic was in principle a gold mine of utmost importance. Our Carthaginian allies were also helping in that regard, securing Corsica for themselves and now selling for Sicily, I think. They never actually made it there due to this Roman fleet here. Luckily for us, the Romans were mostly occupied with the Egyptians and the rest of the Anatolian trade league in the east, which was why we weren't completely wiped out of the map already. Hence Zenobius, who by now had dealt with the secessionist armies, once again was allowed to march for the Roman ports in northern Africa. Although most of our fleets in the west were low on crew and ships, they still possessed immense value to our cause. Cleisthenes, for example, routed the entire Iceni fleet without breaking a sweat. Their inferior ships didn't stand a chance against our Heptarese warships, meaning we now had clear passage to deal with the Iceni strongholds in Gallia. Same could be said for the Massalians, whose armies foolishly sailed to invade Corsica and unexpectedly got caught by our fleet. And with that victory, our fleet sailed for the Pillars of Hercules, from where they would drain our entire economy basically, to regain their true strength, so we in the near future could challenge the city of Massalia itself. As a result of the previous civil war, we mustered a second Hellenic dominant army at our capital. Although it wasn't at full strength, the current situation in Thrace encouraged us to go on the offensive. The Adriatic was our next target, of course. We even hired mercenaries to bolster our numbers, because this army wasn't expected to return home for quite a while. The Macedonian army within our lands, on the other hand, continued its push, marching into Apollonia Pontica without opposition. This was bad in the sense that Glaucus neither could counterattack nor actually reach Odessus in case of another attack. Nevertheless, he marched out, hoping to strike within short time. Luckily for the following winter, that was the exact moment where we for the second time assaulted this rather neglectable port. This time we were way more organized in our attack, with our hoplites splitting up into 3 teams of 2 in the middle to distract the Macedonians, while our Corinthians on the left, along with the cavalry, hoped to win the battle on that side. Or perhaps even that was an option over on the right, where our Thracian falksmen charged into combat. But as predicted, their barbarian ways prevailed over our tactics, with them rushing into combat like headless chickens. Let's just say they didn't really get that far. So this assault basically relied on the left engagement, so we invested additional skirmishers towards the struggle, which made a huge difference, paving the way for our cavalry to charge in. Our combination of Greek and Thracian forces fought mostly in unison to overcome this rather annoying Macedonian threat, leading to us winning a close victory. But a battle that wasn't at all close was the conquest of Apollonia. Here our armies eased its way into the port, accompanied by our 2 fleets that at last were ready to cause some havoc. And havoc they caused. By the winter of 239, the Athenian invasion of Italy began. The city of Taras was the perfect place to launch our invasion from. Not only did this settlement have high walls, making it incredibly hard to get rid of us, but also this settlement was just far enough away from Rome to cause turmoil in the Senate. All we had to do was just take it. The assault began with our siege ships disrupting the defensive emplacements such as this ballistae or that tower. With the harbor cleared, we cruised in with our archers to soften up the garrison. Additionally, our second fleet blasted a hole in their walls for us to circumvent the dangerous choke point the port represented. This meant our superior marines easily could grind through the Roman garrison supported by our ballistae ships, so we could flood the streets and even surround the units contesting the port itself. We actually ended up raising the city, signaling our arrival at the Italian shores. Of course, we rather quickly began rebuilding the city in our own image. From here on out, the plan was to bring over this army to garrison this beachhead, while our fleet dealt with the other coastal settlements. All the way up in northern Gallia, we had also launched a more coordinated attack at the last major Iceni stronghold, but after a rather short siege, they sallied out. Although their units were more skilled than us, our tactics proved to be the deciding factor, as we simply overwhelmed the first army and sent forth a minor regiment to cut off the reinforcements. This allowed us to take out one army at a time, and soon thereafter the rest of northern Gallia. This left the Iceni with just a couple of minor villages for us to deal with. But luckily for us, in a rather unexpected turn of events, the Germanic people surrendered their sovereignty, freeing up the army that otherwise was battling it out with the Germans. This new addition to our larger cause was thus tasked to march south through Germania to help deal with the last Iceni forces, to then possibly link up with the rest and march on Massalia itself. Our spies in northern Africa described how the Romans weren't appreciative of our invasion. Armies were on the move, heading straight back to Magna Graecia. Some even for Caralis. Nevertheless, we fortified our position in Italy and set sail to deal with both the Roman transports and also the Macedonian occupations in Illyria. Epidamnos was rather easy to overcome, thus losing no more than 300 men. At the same time, our Greek city-state vassals were on the move, establishing a massive siege around Pella, a bold but welcoming move which allowed Glaucus to march for Dacia once again. Heck, even the Bithynians were on the move, sailing along the Danube trying to help in our struggle. That and the rather sickly armies we could see the Macedonians had left persuaded me to believe the Getaeans actually didn't need our support anymore. So instead Glaucus deviated towards the boy, and if he had enough time, support the assault on Pella too. The weak state of the Macedonian armies were further admitted as the Macedonians called in a favor among the Illyrian pirates who declared war. A grave mistake from their side, as they clearly hadn't heard what happened to the Detani. As a result, we looted that town and took it for our own. As it didn't have any armies defending that port, I somewhat expected a counterattack, but later found out they were in fact failing to raid some random town beyond the Alps. This conquest also increased our Imperium level once again, which we quickly took advantage of by enlisting governors in our most rebellious provinces. Furthermore, due to our high education system established in Athens, all our new governors had become capable administrators, with a keen eye for empire maintenance before even getting any hands-on experience. Our many victories along our many frontiers made me consider a preemptive attack at Cosentia, but the last second called off the attack in favor of waiting for Glaucus to arrive first. He was well on his way too, as he rather easily dealt with the Macedonian town along with an army that tried to reach Pella to break the siege. I mean, they weren't needed down there anyway, as the walls of Pella withstood our allies, at the cost of major losses though, allowing Glaucus to swoop in and secure it in the name of Athena. It was just a matter of time now before he arrived in Italy. Our plan to seize the ports of our enemies was clearly paying off, with both the Macedonians and the Detani as well as the Iceni rapidly crumbling before our otherwise mediocre armies. Now was the time to test our strategy against Rome. Zenobius razed Iole to the ground for the second time. The Romans quickly counterattacked in a rather dangerous manner, but I forgot to save the battle, so all I basically can say is thank you to our elephants for basically carrying our defense. But now it was our turn to attack. One of our fleets single-handedly carried out 2 assaults on 2 separate Roman ports during the same turn, sacking both. The only reason we didn't occupy these lands was due to this specific legion in Rome that was able to counterattack any port our fleet stayed in, forcing us to, as mentioned, leave after our attacks. This was just the early stage of our invasion of Italy. Massalia, however, was about to get the full treatment. But our joy was somewhat overshadowed by the rather unexpected fall of the Getaean nation, along with the wife of our faction leader. Our selfish move in taking Pella for our own left the Dacians to die in the dark. We had failed them. With the Dacians destroyed, we had to look elsewhere for support against the Macedonians. Glaucus and the fleet by themselves wasn't enough, but just across the Aegean, Pergamon, a city-state that was part of this otherwise profitable trade league in the east, now found it more lucrative to confederate into our vast trade network throughout the Western world. They were already at war with Macedon and some other nation in the Far East, so their decision was sound. With the confederation of Pergamon, there was only one settlement left in order for us to secure hegemony over the Aegean seas. Another member of the trade league, the Bithynians. Agamedes, a Pergamene commander, was presently marching through the region on his way north, along with a formidable army known as Athena's Faithful. Quite fitting, although it would take time before they actually reached the front line. They were now marching for Dacia to enact justice for our fallen allies. In the meantime, over in Gallia, after a prolonged blockade, our two fleets, led by Porphyrius, were at last ready to assault the Massalian capital. To be honest, the city was rather beautiful and well engineered in the sense that they took advantage of this natural river and higher ground to form rather difficult obstacles to overcome. On the other hand, this also brought a few opportunities. After blasting through multiple guard towers on both sides of the dividing river, we prepared to land with our massive fleet both inside and outside of the city to split up the defending garrison. While we were trying to breach their walls, a minor regiment attempted a preemptive attack against our forces, but failed and thus accidentally revealed the biggest obstacle during this entire assault: this wooden bridge. As soon as the walls were down, we launched the attack with both arrows and javelins flying everywhere, with our marines splitting up to both outflank enemies and protect the rear of fellow Athenians. Inside the port itself, we needed every man we could afford, as this was where the Massalian cavalry continuously frontal charged our spearless marines, causing absurd amounts of casualties on our troops. After realizing the eastern assault wasn't going as planned, we blasted another hole in the walls for a minor marine unit to breach through, and thus getting in behind the Massalian lines to attack them from the rear, causing the Massalians to partly fall back to the river. However, by this point, our elite seafaring marines at last managed to cross the daring wooden bridge, resulting in us basically outnumbering the garrison inside the main part of the city. This allowed our troops to take control of the various streets, larger bridges and towers, meaning these retreating Massalian forces just ran straight into our marines. The city was ours. As a precaution and also a bit of revenge, we razed the city to make sure the Massalians never would recover again, even if they recaptured the city. In some foolish hope, they named Narbo as their new capital, as if it wasn't our next target. A blockade was immediately established with a smaller army from Iberia, namely the one that defended our copper mine from the Editani, now marching for Transpalt Gaul to ensure Athenian hegemony over that province. The following summer we captured the port along with the olive gardens of Tolosa, supported by the stout defenders of Diospolis. We had now successfully split the Massalian nation in two with only one port left. It was too close to Rome for us to dare an assault, but in the grand scheme of things it didn't matter. The Massalian oligarchy was stuck in Gaul without access to sea trade, meaning our naval strategy was doing its thing to perfection. Further north, the already isolated Iceni were by now left with just 3 towns, and we had 3 armies to go for each one at the same time. But first we had to deal with this rather well-equipped Britannic force. Although our men at this battle only had a fraction of the same armor, our cunning tactics proved to be the deciding factor. Our lesser army caught the attention of the Iceni forces engaging in a rather fierce struggle. This allowed our more stealthy units from Britannia to sneak in behind the hostile lines and cut down this raiding party. Our casualties were expectedly quite high, but with a quick rest inside our own lands, our armies would be ready in no time. If only it was that simple, as an additional army marched forward, forcing us to retreat. We had to wait for reinforcements to arrive. The middle town was also rather heavily defended, meaning that breakthrough had to come from Germania, which it did. Our other army fled all the way back to Eurolibona to stay guarded and replenish. This proved to be vital as the Iceni thus overextended, allowing us to defeat their second major army. This was slow progress, of course, but I would rather take that than a treacherous trade partner who we granted independent rule that declared war upon our Punic allies over some ancient territorial dispute. Because of our support to Carthage, they sacked Heraclion and almost did the same to Artemida, if not for our heroic defense. Another war had broken out in Iberia. Zenobius, who probably still mourned the death of his wife, once again was destined to return to Iberia and finish off this barbarian threat once and for all. He wasn't alone in this endeavor, with the now legendary Cleisthenes seizing control of Brigantium, leaving the Titani without food or shelter. A great feat for the veteran who was among the pioneers that sailed from Greece to these unknown lands in the west. After spending the season raiding their former homeland trying to survive, they decided upon fighting one last battle to the death, where Cleisthenes had to use every tool available to survive. After discovering the Titani fleet tried to land and link up with their ground forces, we sent forth our ships to ram them down one by one. The ballista ships made the whole process a lot easier too, as they just shot down any ship protected by any nearby wreckage, although the fire also harmed our own ships. After that, the ships returned to port, where a massive storm of arrows was harassing the Iberians that had seized control of the town. Their numbers rather quickly dwindled courtesy of our ranged advantage. Whereas the Titani began burning our flagship, Cleisthenes was forced to land with the other marine units, putting him in huge danger, especially as the ballistae weren't always all that accurate. Nevertheless, he barely survived the struggle, meaning Cleisthenes single-handedly now had occupied the entire western coast of Iberia and Gaul. Apart from New Athens, of course. The eastern coast of Iberia, on the other hand, was all claimed by Porphyrius, who, unlike the last time we defeated Mastia, saw the importance of a unified Iberia under Hellenic rule and thus captured the town, instead of liberating it like Isocrates once did in the past. This left the Orytani with one minor settlement at the heart of Iberia. Zenobius was the only one in position to reach it. After crushing one army at Heraklion, along with the fleet in ruins, Zenobius slowly crept up on the Iberians, replenishing his forces along the way, until he finally caught the Orytani off guard and pacified the Iberian Peninsula for good. Over in Greece too, the story was similarly tedious. The lost Macedonian fleet was raiding the trade ships sailing through the Aegean. Something had to be done, so we called for the nearest fleet, the one in the Adriatic, to sail back home and inevitably sink the Macedonian fleet, allowing our valuable trade to keep flowing. Sadly, this was at the cost of whatever pressure we had on the Roman ports in Italy, allowing them to muster a grand fleet strong enough to invade Greece and take Apollonia. By this point, Glaucus had already left Pella in favor of hunting down the last Macedonians, just like Archimedes the Pergamonian, who had engaged the enemies in Dacia. So it all came down to our lone fleet in the east to sail straight back to the Adriatic. Of course, it was clear that by the size of the Roman fleet it couldn't have been built in Italy during the short time we were gone, but perhaps Sicily or Africa instead. Due to this uncertainty, we called for one of the fleets who fought against the Massalians to sail for Sicily and capture both Panormus and Akragas. After reviewing the wharves established here, it was evident this was where the Roman fleet originated from. So with this conquest and no Roman armies able to retake them without sailing through our fleets or dealing with our beachhead in Magna Graecia, all we had to do if we wanted to secure hegemony over the Western Mediterranean was defeat this damned fleet. Against the odds and on low supply, our fleet engaged the Romans. However, right off the bat, the battle was decided. After not having experienced any resistance against the Romans at sea, we just formed up in two simple lines. But the Romans, however, this time had a plan. As we sailed forward, the Romans split up their columns, trying to outflank our fleet. Our marines, of course, were more skilled in ramming and simply destroyed the Romans on impact, but a large amount eventually actually got stunned, allowing the Romans to take down many of our ships. After discovering the travesty that was at hand, the Athenian fleet withdrew, back to Crete, leaving Apollonia in the hands of Rome. This wasn't all bad though, because if not for this attack, and the many Roman ships we destroyed in our initial charge, the Romans would have been able to occupy Epidamnus as well. But now we were able to defend it, smashing this once great Roman fleet into bits. Our army at Taris would shortly thereafter sail back to Apollonia, recapturing it just returned back to Magna Graecia waiting for the right moment to strike. We had successfully dismantled the Roman naval presence, and by the same time mopped up Macedonian outposts in Dacia, with both Glaucus and Archimedes liberating the local tribes to do as they wished. Antigonus Gonatas was still at large, roaming the countryside. Then, in an act to decide his own fate, he, along with whatever loyal forces he still had under his command, marched for the now Athenian-occupied city of Delminium in Illyria, where he made a hopeless last stand. With him gone and the Macedonians destroyed, Gaul was the only area left outside Latin influence with Roman allies. It was of course Massalia and the Iceni, and for some reason also the Sequani, who I more than anything believe were allies of the Iceni rather than anything. As a matter of fact, the Sequani were the only ones standing in the way of us defeating the Iceni, mainly due to their army being stronger and less exhausted from battles like ours were. But to our fortune, we had another army lurking nearby for ambushing opportunities. So as the Sequani didn't realize the danger they were in, we attacked, taking down this army from both sides. This didn't mean we could march on the Iceni settlement, but rather return to our own settlements where a smaller elite Iceni army was invading us. But our retreat wasn't hasty enough, as the Iceni attacked, causing quite a lot of issues for our lesser equipped garrison. But thanks to our clever usage of the terrain and layout, we managed to occasionally bunch together the attackers, making effective usage of our archers and slowly falling back to more favorable defensive positions where our larger numbers had a more meaningful impact, allowing us to barely win the battle. So instead, our two armies chose to take down any other minor Iceni raiding party within our lands and replenish in the process. This was basically the ever-continuing story of this almost trench warfare-like conflict over Gaul, where after every battle both sides suffered too many casualties to get an edge over the other. Nevertheless, we never gave up, with this new army mixed of both Iberian and Gallic troops marching into the undefended city of Nemosas, forcing the Massalians to withdraw their government all the way up to the walled city of Bibracte. This was of course the fourth active army operating in Gaul, making this by far the most intense part of this conflict apart from what the Mediterranean was until recently. After our little attack, the Massalians immediately made a massive counterattack, and probably the most cursed defensive battle I've ever fought, but still narrowly edging out a Pyrrhic victory in the end. Down at the city of Massalia we also had a fifth army stationed, but it was kept in reserve for an upcoming invasion and potential occupation of Italy that would begin once Glaucus arrived in Cisalpine Gaul. After his little detour in Dacia, he was by now on his way, and once he reached the province, we swooped in to capture Genoa. The Pergamonian army led by Archimedes was also expected to participate in the invasion from the south, but unexpectedly had to stay in the east as the Scythian nomads suddenly launched raids into Thrace, taking Odysseus and our trained slave resource along with it. It didn't take long for us to establish an agreement of shared land in the province, but kept this army here to deter other scheming tribes considering taking advantage of our larger conflict in the west. I mean, one army in the south seemed enough by itself, as it at last was allowed to march for Cosentia, meeting Roman armies on the field of battle. Here our Cretan archers showed their supremacy over the Roman slingers, before the two lines crashed together in a major bloodbath. Once locked together, our Illyrian raiders flanked around, through their pillars, and then charged in with their axes breaking the Roman lines, just like Glaucus did at Octavium in Cisalpine Gaul. It was the same flanking concept, but with a more sturdy Hellenic core of units and a few Thracian falsmen to run around the edges. No matter the differences in army setups, the results were the same: decisive victories and further Athenian control over the Roman world. After some more back and forth conflicts, we finally captured another Iceni settlement, meaning we began eyeing up this Belgae town, the last hideout of the Iceni. However, it was once again defended by the annoying Sequani, who continuously obscured our progression. If we wanted the Iceni destroyed, we needed all our armies available. Massalia had to fall first. So we sent out one army down towards Lemonum, and after we captured Medland, forced two other armies into the dangerous Alps, from where they would take down these hideouts defended by natural terrain, leaving the Massalians with the walled city of Bibracte. Over in Iberia, the Romans for one last time tried to bribe the locals to rise up against us, but was repelled at the walls, leaving the only way out of this conflict in their own hands. So as our southern invading army was down in Sicily to secure the former Greek colony of Syracuse, the first place we actually met the Romans, fighting Carthage, the Roman legion stationed at Rome marched for Terrace. At haste we marched north, and thankfully due to our naval advantage we were able to sail into the port to reinforce, and thus deter a potential attack for another season, allowing our armies to eventually break the siege. After this we stormed the city of Bibracte with 3 separate armies uniting in a single attack to defeat the Massalians for good. At the same time, Cleisthenes, who by now had returned to the Mediterranean, launched an attack on the Romanized city of Carthage along with Porphyrius. However, the two conquerors of the Iberian coastlines received a massive surprise by the fact that the city of Carthage was nowhere near like the city described by our Punic allies. This forced our otherwise battle-ready fleet into a 50 days assault, slowly breaking down the now Romanized defenses just to be cut down once the ground assault began. This was a shameful display of the highest order, something the now old and stubborn Cleisthenes wouldn't accept. He and Porphyrius cooked up a plan of Porphyrius distracting the Roman armies along the coastline, while Cleisthenes led a covert mission into the city supply depot where they would try to set the Roman supplies on fire, forcing them to abandon the walled city. However, this was quickly discovered, with Cleisthenes and his men gradually being forced to break off to keep away the Romans trying to defend the supplies, eventually resulting in the death of this legendary admiral. After hearing of this travesty, Porphyrius called off the attack, fleeing back to Sicily. This was a catastrophe for the Hellenic world, especially politically, where the party Cleisthenes formerly led now was in outroar, demanding justice upon the other Athenian elites. Securing loyalty wasn't enough. If we didn't solve this issue, the entirety of Iberia would break off, starting another civil war. Not to forget the many armies that politicians commanded throughout the realm, many of whom were either in Gaul or Italy. There was only one way to solving this situation, and it required gold. Lots of gold. There was only one option left to avoid disaster: loot the last Iceni settlement or face the biggest setback imaginable. This was probably one of the most important battles of this entire campaign. The Hellenic realm relied upon this inferior army defeating the vast Iceni numbers. It was time to focus. Knowing our army had no holding power to perform hammer and anvil maneuvers like we were doing in Italy, we had to make sure we absolutely crushed one flank so decisively that it caused a tidal wave of units to fall upon one unit at a time, and thus maybe get a Pyrrhic victory. But it was time to ride out. By some miracle, we had won the day. This looting and destruction of the Iceni granted us enough resources to promote almost every politician in the Erechis party. Furthermore, we had to pay for dozens of marriages to the former children of our own party's elites, who had abandoned our political views in favor of renown elsewhere. This was really humiliating, but it had to be done to avoid disaster. In the grand scheme of things, this victory over the Iceni symbolized the fall of the last Roman supporting faction, leaving the devious traitors divided, isolated and alone. Apart from the annoying Sequani, of course, but they were defeated courtesy of our Germanic trade partners. The isolation of Italy and the city of Rome itself forced the Senate into action. They mustered an entire army out of thin air and were now marching south to re-establish the connection between Italy and the armies of Africa. However, whenever they tried to force a decisive battle, we simply retreated, waiting for the armies of the north to enter Italy through the Alps. But by some dumb luck miracle, we caught one of the newly raised armies all by itself. I guess they didn't expect an Athenian army to be hiding in the nearby forest. But once they realized we were here, they honorably marched to fight us, perhaps in an act of overconfidence. Nevertheless, the trees massively obscured any tactical maneuvering, which thus favored the Roman legion. Our men were desperately holding on, with many of our troops failing to dodge the Roman gladiators. Eventually, however, we managed to get an edge on the Latin Republic. With that victory, the northern invasion began. Glaucus gave the orders to desolate these lands, razing everything to ash, allowing slums to form in whatever rubble that was left. The Roman legions desperately tried to force another battle, but once again allowed us to divide and defeat their forces. Italy was completely destroyed. All the Romans had left was the former homeland of the Carthaginians. After having failed to take Carthage once and suffered the consequences for it, we now prepared a grand invasion from Sicily. The Egyptians were in on it too, with them seizing Thapsus. We, on the other hand, invested 3 complete fleets to blockade and safeguard the voyage, along with 3 additional ground armies to take on the towns further inland. Glaucus wasn't part of this invasion though. Instead, he stayed in Italy, making sure no Roman tricks could deceive us here again, and also signed the agreed military alliance with the Bithynians, officially securing the Aegean under Athenian or allied influence. The Romans, fearing the mighty armies coming for them, now abandoned Carthage in favor of defeating the Egyptians one last time. This meant our fleet could just swoop in and take the town, while our other armies marched inland. The Romans actually managed to counterattack, destroying the 2 fleets garrisoning Thapsus, but by this point it was too late. Our armies had overrun their last bastion, taking everything in the name of Athena. The Mediterranean War was finally over. We had redeemed our actions against the Carthaginians, who now served as a crucial ally, policing the maritime trade lanes against piracy. By the year 232, the age of colonization was over, because not only had we established colonies in the west, but also fully Hellenized the entire land. Of course, not everyone were willing to convert to our ways, demanding our armies to be stationed throughout our grand realm, many of whom were stationed in either Britannia, Gaul or Thrace, as the barbarian tribes beyond our borders also had begun looking at our larger trade network as a potential source of wealth. This was of course a concern, as our own trade routes greatly surpassed the ones of the Eastern Trade League. With the common enemies in Rome now gone, the Galatians, who ruled most of Anatolia, called for action, declaring war, pleading their allies to help in this endeavor. This was a war that desperately needed the likes of Cleisthenes, Glaucus or Zenobius. But shortly after the war, both Glaucus and Zenobius fell incredibly ill, dying of old age. Most remarkable was the fact that neither actually seized the opportunity after the previous civil war to proclaim themselves emperor, instead favoring the democratic system Athens had been ruled by for years. Nevertheless, these heroes from the age of colonization were now gone, marking the end of this generation. It was now up to the upcoming politicians and leaders to lead Athens in this new war of the Eastern Mediterranean. A new generation of heroes whose tale will be told another time. But until then, goodbye.